The moment the new evidence dropped, everything changed for D4VD. Not just online. Not just in court. But inside the prison walls. Because what investigators revealed wasn't just shocking, it was the kind of information that spreads fast behind bars, the kind that turns an inmate into a target overnight. And according to multiple sources, that's exactly what's happening right now. We're talking about evidence so disturbing, so detailed, that even people who had been defending him suddenly went quiet. Amazon orders. Fake identities. Items that don't belong in any normal home, let alone tied to a public figure. And the moment those details were read out loud in court, everything shifted. One reaction online said it best. Once that paperwork hits the cell block, it's over. Now if you don't understand how prison works, let me break it down for you. Inside, your charges aren't private. They get passed around. Read. Judged. And once inmates decide what kind of person you are, there's no going back. Which means for D4VD, this isn't just about fighting a case anymore. It's about survival. Because according to reports, he's already been moved into a more restricted unit, isolated, monitored, and treated as a high-risk inmate. And even that might not be enough to keep him safe. Because the real danger isn't just the system. It's the other inmates. The ones who are already reacting. Already talking. Already waiting. So what exactly did the new evidence reveal that made things this serious? Why are people saying he could be cooked the moment he steps into the wrong area? And what happened inside that courtroom that turned this situation from bad to completely out of control? Stay with me. Because what we're about to break down doesn't just expose the case. It explains why D4VD might be in more danger now than ever before. To understand why this situation escalated so quickly, and why D4VD is now being talked about as a target inside prison, you have to go back to the beginning, because this didn't just come out of nowhere. This was building. Quietly. Slowly. And almost no one saw how serious it was getting until it was too late. For a long time, D4VD was known for something completely different. A rising artist. A creative mind. Someone who built a following off emotion, storytelling, and a unique sound that connected with people on a deep level. His name wasn't tied to controversy, it was tied to growth. Which is exactly why what's happening now feels so shocking. Because this isn't just a fall from grace. It's a complete shift in how people see him. And it all started with small things, things that didn't seem important at first. Subtle rumors. Quiet speculation. People noticing inconsistencies in his story, his movements, his relationships. At the time, most fans brushed it off. Just internet noise. People reaching for attention. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. According to multiple reports, investigators had already started paying close attention long before the public knew anything. They weren't reacting, they were watching. Tracking patterns. Collecting data. Waiting. And that's where this story takes a darker turn. Because the more they looked into things, the more unusual details started to surface. Not enough to go public. Not enough to accuse. But enough to raise serious questions. And then came the first real break. A connection. A person. A situation that tied D4VD to something much more serious than anyone expected. That's when the name Celeste entered the conversation. At first, very little was known. Just whispers. Mentions in discussions that didn't fully explain what was going on. But what people did notice was this. Her name kept coming up, in connection with him. And not in a normal way. As more details began to surface, the picture became more complicated. This wasn't just a casual relationship. This was something deeper. More private. More hidden. And possibly, more volatile. Then came the timeline. And this is where things started to feel off. Because when investigators began lining up events, dates, messages, movements, there were gaps. moments that didn't match, decisions that didn't make sense, and actions that raised more questions than answers. That's when the case quietly intensified. According to insiders, this is when surveillance increased. Digital records were pulled. Devices were monitored. And conversations, ones that no one thought would ever be seen, were suddenly being documented. And here's the part that most people didn't realize at the time. This wasn't a quick investigation. This was a slow build. Months of observation. Waiting for the right moment. Letting everything unfold naturally so that nothing would be missed. Which explains one of the biggest questions people are asking right now. Why did it take so long? The answer? Because authorities weren't rushing. They were collecting. Piece by piece. Until they had something that couldn't be ignored. And when that moment finally came, it didn't just impact the case. It changed everything for D4VD. Because once the information started coming out, once the court hearing happened, everything that had been hidden suddenly became public. And that's where things took a turn that no one could control anymore. Because once details hit the courtroom, they don't stay there. They spread. Fast. Especially when those details are as disturbing as what was revealed. According to court reports, evidence was presented that pointed to preparation. Planning. Actions taken ahead of time that didn't look random. And once that idea entered the public conversation, that this might not have been spontaneous. People started looking at everything differently. But outside the courtroom, something even more dangerous was happening. Because while the internet debated, the prison system reacted. And inside that system, information moves differently. Faster. Rawer. More direct. As one former inmate explained, once someone's charges are known, they don't stay private. They get passed from cell to cell. Read. Discussed. Judged. And that's where the real risk begins. Because inside, reputation isn't built on music. It's built on your charges. And once people decide how they feel about those charges, that's it. Now, according to reports, D4VD has already been placed under stricter conditions. Limited movement. Restricted interaction. More isolation than the average inmate. Which tells you one thing. Officials know there's a risk. But here's the problem. Even with those precautions, there's no such thing as complete safety. Because at some point, interaction happens. Even if it's brief. Even if it's controlled. And when it does, that's when things can go wrong. Especially if the narrative surrounding you has already spread. And right now, that narrative is getting worse by the day. Because what was revealed in court didn't just raise questions. It created a perception. One that's now being repeated, analyzed, and believed by people both outside and inside the system. And the more it spreads, the more dangerous it becomes. Because in a place where perception is everything, being seen the wrong way can cost you more than just your reputation. It can cost you your safety. And with more evidence continuing to surface, and more details being discussed publicly, there's only one question left. What exactly did they reveal that made his situation this serious? Because whatever it was, it didn't just change the case. It changed how everyone sees him. And that's where things take an even darker turn. The moment the courtroom went quiet, that's when everything shifted. Because what prosecutors revealed next didn't just add to the case, it completely redefined it. And for D4VD, this was the exact moment where things went from serious to almost impossible to come back from. At first, it started like any other hearing. Legal language. Structured arguments. Nothing too explosive, at least not on the surface. But then, they started listing the evidence. One item at a time. And the deeper they went, the more the room changed. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't circumstantial. This looked planned. According to court details, investigators presented a series of purchases that immediately raised eyebrows, items that didn't belong together under normal circumstances. Heavy-duty materials, tools, equipment that suggested preparation rather than panic. And what made it worse? The way they were obtained. Through online platforms. Delivered quietly. Using a name that didn't match his. A fake identity. And just like that, the entire tone of the case shifted. Because now, it wasn't just about what happened. It was about what may have been prepared in advance. That alone was enough to shake the room. But prosecutors didn't stop there. Because right after that, they introduced another layer. One that made everything even more intense. Digital evidence. We're talking about messages, activity logs, and data pulled from devices, information that had been quietly collected over time. And according to insiders, this wasn't a small amount. It was massive. Detailed. Organized. And it told a story. A story that suggested something was unfolding behind the scenes long before anyone realized. Now imagine sitting in that courtroom, hearing each piece of that puzzle being laid out, and realizing that this wasn't just speculation anymore. This was structured, backed, built step by step. But here's where things took a turn that no one expected. Because just when it seemed like the prosecution had already revealed enough to make their point, they introduced something else. A video. Not a public clip. Not something circulating online. But something pulled directly from a private source. And according to those present, the energy in the room changed instantly. Because in that video, D4VD appeared calm. Too calm. Speaking directly to the camera. Saying things that didn't seem connected at first. But when placed in context, they raised serious questions. He talked about chaos. About difficult times. About people disappearing from his life. And while none of it was an outright confession, investigators pointed out something that made everyone pause. The timing. Because the metadata, yes, the actual digital timestamp, lined up almost perfectly with when authorities believe everything happened. That detail alone? It shook the defense. Because now, it wasn't just about what was said. It was about when it was said. And why. But even that wasn't the biggest twist. Because what came next? That's what changed everything. Prosecutors introduced communication records, messages exchanged between D4VD and the person at the center of this case. And while the full content wasn't read publicly, key parts were enough to paint a picture. A picture of tension, of pressure, of something building beneath the surface. According to reports, there were indications that this situation wasn't stable. That there were disagreements. Possibly even threats. And one detail stood out above all the rest. A suggestion that the other person may have been preparing to go to authorities. Now think about that for a second. If that's true, then this wasn't just a random event. It becomes motive. And motive? That changes everything. Because now, the narrative isn't just about what happened. It's about why it might have happened. And once that idea entered the room, everything became heavier. More serious. More final. But just when it felt like the case had reached its peak, another twist hit. And this one? It didn't come from prosecutors. It came from outside. Because while all of this was unfolding in court, information started leaking online. Not full documents. Not official releases. But pieces. Fragments. Enough to spark speculation. And within hours, social media was flooded with theories. People breaking down timelines. Comparing statements. Trying to connect dots that weren't fully visible yet. And that's when one detail started gaining attention. A connection to someone else. A name that hadn't been fully explored until now. A person described as being close to D4VD. very close, and according to some sources, potentially holding information that could change the direction of the case. That name? It started trending. Quietly at first, then louder. And as more people dug into it, old photos resurfaced. Clips, posts, moments that didn't seem important before, but now, they look different. Like pieces of something bigger. Something that hadn't been fully revealed yet. And that's when the first major twist truly landed. Because now, the case wasn't just about one person. It was expanding. Pulling in new angles. New possibilities. New questions. And the biggest one of all? What else hasn't been revealed yet? Because if this much came out in just one hearing, if this many details surfaced all at once, then what's still being held back? What's still being prepared? And more importantly, how much worse can this get? Because right now, with the evidence stacking up, with the narrative shifting, and with the tension growing both inside and outside the system, one thing is becoming very clear. This isn't slowing down. It's escalating. And whatever comes next might be the moment that turns this entire situation from serious to completely irreversible. Just when it felt like the courtroom revelations had already pushed this situation to its limit, something even more intense started happening outside those walls. Because while the legal side was building quietly, the internet exploded. And once the details began circulating publicly, D4VD wasn't just facing a case anymore. He was facing a narrative. And that narrative? It was spreading fast. Clips from the hearing. Breakdowns of the evidence. People reposting and analyzing every single detail like it was a puzzle that needed to be solved in real time. And the more people looked into it, the more disturbing it started to feel. Because suddenly, things that seemed small before didn't look small anymore. One of the biggest talking points? The purchases. The timing. The pattern. Fans and commentators started lining up the reported items, tools, materials, and deliveries, and asking one question. Why would anyone need all of this at that specific time? That question alone? It fueled hours of debate. And once that debate started, it didn't stop. Meanwhile, more insiders began speaking out, quietly at first, then more openly. Not official statements. Not confirmed reports. But enough to keep the story moving. One source claimed that investigators weren't just looking at physical evidence. They were building a digital timeline. Tracking movements. Messages. Behavior patterns. And according to that source, what they found didn't look random. It looked structured. Now whether that's true or not. The impact? Immediate. Because once people believe something was structured, they start assuming intent. And that's when the narrative shifts from what happened to what was planned. And that's a completely different level of seriousness. But here's where things take a shocking turn. Because just as the conversation reached its peak, another piece of content surfaced. And this one? It hit differently. It wasn't from the courtroom. It wasn't from investigators. It was from online archives. An old clip. Something that had been posted long before any of this came out. In the clip, D4VD is talking casually. But what he says, it didn't sit right with people anymore. He describes an idea, an alter ego. A version of himself that exists in a different mindset. A character. Someone who operates outside normal rules. At the time, it sounded creative. Artistic. Even interesting. But now? People weren't seeing it that way anymore. Now they were asking. Was that just imagination, or something deeper? And once that question entered the conversation, everything became more intense. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about evidence. It was about mindset. And that's something people react to emotionally. Now social media started dividing again. One side said, "You're reaching, artists say stuff like that all the time." But the other side? They weren't convinced. Out of all the examples he could have used, why that? That don't sound random anymore. And just like that, the psychological angle entered the story. And when that happens, the situation gets heavier. Because now people aren't just analyzing actions. They are analyzing intent. But that wasn't the only thing making waves. Because another detail started gaining attention. One that hadn't been fully discussed yet. The data. Reports suggested that investigators had access to an enormous amount of digital evidence. We're talking about files, messages, records, and not just a few gigabytes, but an overwhelming amount. So much that even legal teams acknowledged it would take time to review everything. Now think about that. If there's that much information, then what we've seen so far is only a fraction. And that realization? It shook people. Because now the question isn't what has been revealed. It's what hasn't been revealed yet. And that's where the fear started setting in. Because the idea that more could come out, more details, more connections, more explanations, it created tension. Not just for those following the case, but for D4VD himself. Because inside the prison system, information like this doesn't stay outside. It finds its way in. And when it does, it spreads differently, faster, more directly. As former inmates have described, once someone's situation becomes public like this, it becomes part of the internal conversation. And that's where things get dangerous. Because perception inside those walls isn't shaped by full context. It's shaped by fragments, by headlines, by word of mouth. And right now, those fragments aren't looking good. Which explains the next major development. Because according to reports, D4VD's conditions changed again. More restrictions, more monitoring, less interaction. Not as punishment, but as precaution. And that alone tells you everything. Because when a facility starts increasing restrictions like that, it means they see a risk. A real one. But here's the part that makes this even more intense. Because despite all of that, despite the isolation, despite the monitoring, there's still no such thing as complete protection. At some point, interaction happens. Movement happens. And when it does, that's when situations can escalate. Especially if the narrative surrounding you has already spread. And right now, that narrative is still growing. Because just when people thought they had a grasp on what was going on, another rumor started circulating. One that hasn't been confirmed, but has been repeated enough to raise eyebrows. That there may be more individuals connected to this situation. More than what's been publicly acknowledged. Now whether that's true or not. The impact? Massive. Because now the story isn't just expanding. It's evolving. Into something bigger than a single case. A situation with layers. With connections. With pieces that haven't fully come together yet. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because everything we've seen so far, the evidence, the reactions, the conditions inside prison, it's all building towards something. And whatever that something is, it hasn't fully revealed itself yet. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. What happens when the next piece of evidence drops? Because if what we've already seen is this intense, then whatever comes next might not just escalate the situation. It might completely redefine it. The moment this story broke beyond the courtroom, it didn't just trend, it took over. Every platform, every timeline, every comment section. And suddenly, D4VD wasn't just part of a legal case anymore. He became the center of a full-blown internet war. Because people weren't just reacting. They were choosing sides. On one side, you had fans who refused to believe what they were hearing. People who had followed his journey from the beginning, who connected with his music, his story, his rise, and they weren't ready to let that image go. Comments started flooding in like, "This doesn't sound like him, something's off. They are building a narrative, we haven't seen the full truth. Innocent until proven guilty, why is everyone acting like it's already decided?" For them, this wasn't just news. It felt personal. Like someone they supported was being torn down in real time. But on the other side, the tone was completely different. Because once the details started spreading, the purchases, the timeline, the digital evidence, some people weren't questioning anymore. They were convinced. You don't accidentally line all that up. That's not coincidence, that's planning. There's too much evidence for this to be random. And just like that, the internet split in two. Defenders versus accusers. Believers versus skeptics. And the louder it got, the more intense it became. But here's where things really started to shift. Because it wasn't just fans anymore. The industry started reacting too. At first, subtly. Unfollowings. Old collaborators going quiet. People who used to publicly support him suddenly stepping back without saying a word. And in this space, silence speaks loud. Because when people distance themselves without explanation, it sends a message. Even if they never say it out loud. Then came the influencers. Content creators breaking down every detail of the case. Analyzing timelines. Comparing statements. Building entire videos around what's been revealed so far. One viral breakdown video even said, "This isn't just a case, this is a digital trail that tells a story." That line? It stuck. Because that's exactly how people started seeing it. Not as isolated events, but as connected pieces. And once that perspective takes hold, it's hard to undo. Meanwhile, reactions from people with real-world experience, former inmates, legal commentators, even anonymous insiders, started gaining attention. Because they weren't just reacting emotionally. They were explaining what this could mean. One former inmate described how quickly information like this spreads inside a facility. Once your paperwork gets around, it's not about who you are anymore. It's about what you're in for. That statement alone? It changed how people viewed the situation. Because now the focus wasn't just on the case. It was on what happens next. Inside. And that's when the concern shifted from curiosity to fear. Because if even part of what's being said is true, then D4VD isn't just dealing with public opinion. He's dealing with something much more immediate. Much more unpredictable. But just when it felt like the conversation couldn't get more intense, another reaction surfaced. And this one? It hit differently. A verified account, someone known to have connections in both the music world and legal circles, posted a single sentence. People don't realize how much hasn't been shown yet. No names. No details. But that message? It shook everything. Because it introduced a new idea. That what we've seen so far might only be the surface. And if that's true, then the current reactions? The debates? The conclusions people are already making? They might be based on incomplete information. And that realization created a new wave of tension. Because now people weren't just reacting to what they knew. They were reacting to what they didn't know. Which made everything feel unstable. Unfinished. Like the story could change at any moment. And in a situation like this, that's exactly what keeps people watching. Because no one wants to be wrong. No one wants to pick a side too early. But at the same time, no one can look away. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because right now, with opinions forming, narratives spreading, and more details expected to surface, this situation isn't settling. It's building towards something bigger. Something that could either confirm everything people believe right now, or completely flip it in the opposite direction. And if that happens, the reactions we're seeing today will look completely different tomorrow. Because this story, it's still moving, still evolving, and still far from over. Just when it felt like the story had reached its peak, something surfaced that nobody was ready for. Not another rumor, not another theory, but a detail, quiet at first, that started spreading through smaller accounts before it suddenly exploded everywhere. And the moment people connected it to D4VD, everything changed. Because according to multiple discussions circulating online, investigators didn't just gather evidence after everything happened. They were already watching before. Not reacting. Not catching up. Watching. And if that's true, then this entire situation becomes something completely different. Because now the timeline isn't just about what happened. It's about what was already known. Reports began pointing to the possibility of extended surveillance, digital tracking, communication monitoring, and patterns being studied long before any public move was made. And suddenly, that big question everyone had earlier. Why did it take so long? It had a new answer. Because it didn't take long. It was allowed to unfold. Now think about that for a second. If investigators were already collecting information, if conversations were already being monitored, if behavior was already being tracked, then what we're seeing right now might not be the beginning of the case. It might be the end of a much longer story. And that realization? It shook people. Because it means something much bigger may have been happening behind the scenes this entire time. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because right as that theory started gaining traction, another detail resurfaced. One that had already been mentioned, but not fully understood. The amount of data. The report suggesting an overwhelming volume of digital evidence, files, messages, records, so extensive that it would take significant time just to process. At first, that sounded like a technical detail. But now, it feels different. Because if there's that much information, then what we've seen so far is just a fraction. A small piece of something much larger. And that's when the final twist hit. Because along with that realization came a chilling possibility. That there are details within that data. Details that haven't been made public. That could completely change how this entire situation is understood. Now imagine that for a moment. Imagine there's information sitting in those files that hasn't been revealed yet. Information that could confirm everything. Or completely flip the narrative in a way no one expects. That uncertainty? That's what makes this moment so critical. Because right now, nobody knows what's coming next. Not the public. Not the fans. And possibly, not even the people directly involved. Meanwhile, inside the prison system, the situation hasn't paused. Because even though updates have slowed publicly, the narrative that's already spread, it's still there. And in an environment where perception can define everything, that narrative doesn't just disappear. It stays. It builds. It shapes how people react. Which means for D4VD, this isn't just about waiting for the next hearing. It's about navigating every day under a spotlight that doesn't turn off. And here's the part that has people on edge the most. Because just as everything went quiet again, no new statements, no new leaks, no new confirmations. A small but powerful interaction happened online. A single reaction. Subtle. Easy to miss. But impossible to ignore once you see it. Because a post discussing the situation, one that suggested this might be far bigger than what's been revealed, received engagement from an account linked to someone close to the case. No explanation. No follow-up. Just that one interaction. And that alone? It reignited everything. Because in situations like this, small moves speak loudly. And now people are asking the question that changes everything. What do they know that we don't? Because if there's even one piece of information still hidden, one detail that hasn't been exposed, then everything we think we understand right now could shift instantly. And that's why this story feels unfinished. Because it is unfinished. We don't have the full picture. We don't have all the answers. And until we do, every update, every leak, every reaction has the potential to change everything. So now the real question isn't just what happened. It's this. What happens when the rest finally comes out? Because if what we've seen so far is already this intense, then whatever is still hidden might not just shock the internet. It might completely redefine this entire case. And trust me, something tells me we're not done yet. Not even close. Now I want you to really think about everything we just broke down. Because this situation, it's not simple anymore. Do you believe D4VD is being judged too early based on what's been revealed so far? Or do you think the evidence we've seen already tells the full story? And here's the bigger question. If there's still more information that hasn't come out yet, more files, more messages, more details, do you think it's going to make things better for him? Or much worse? Because right now, the internet is split. Some people are saying this is all being built up without full context. Others are convinced that what's been revealed already is enough. But the truth is, we're still in the middle of this. And the next update could flip everything. So I want you to go down to the comments right now and tell me. White right pointing backhand index, do you think he's innocent, or is this just the beginning of everything coming out? White right pointing backhand index, what part of this case shocked you the most? White right pointing backhand index, and do you believe there's something bigger still hidden behind the scenes? Let's get a real conversation going. Because the more people dig into this, the closer we get to understanding what's really happening. And if you've been following this story from the start, you already know this is moving fast. So make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the moment anything new drops, we're going to break it down immediately. No delays. No missed details. And trust me, if what's already been revealed is this intense, you do not want to miss what comes next. Because this story, it's far from over.